So I'm very happy to introduce our first speaker for today, Lara Ostaric. She is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Temple University. She specializes in the history of modern philosophy, especially the works of Immanuel Kant and also the German idealists. She also has interests in aesthetics and moral philosophy. She has held a number of fellowships here in Germany, including at LMU München, at the Universität Leipzig, and also most recently, she was the Alexander von Humboldt Fellow at the Universität Heidelberg. Lara is the author of many, many publications, but I'm just going to mention two that I think are particularly relevant for our topic today. She is the editor of Interpreting Schelling, Critical Essays, which came out with Cambridge University Press in 2014. And this was one of the first English language collections of essays on Schelling. So this was a very, very important volume. She is also the author of the monograph, which just came out with Cambridge in 2023, The Critique of Judgment and the Unity of Kant's Critical System. Today, her talk is entitled Spontaneity and Receptivity in Schelling's and Schopenhauer's Conception of Creative Agency. Lara has told me that she's happy to, that the talk will be in English, but she's happy to take questions in either English or German. So please join me in welcoming Lara Ostaric.
So many thanks to organizers, Thomas, and Alexi for this wonderful opportunity, something that I've been waiting for a long time, and hopefully, thank you, will be helpful in developing my next project, which will be on Schelling's aesthetics and romanticism. I think I'm good. Yeah. Okay, all right. So in current literature, there are two dominant trends of approaching the notion of the unconditioned or absolute in post-Kantian thinkers. One approach emphasizes the epistemological significance of the concept. In early Romanticism, on the one hand, its role as the condition of the possibility of self-consciousness. On the other, the early Romantics' ultimate skepticism concerning our possibility to have knowledge of it. The other approach stresses not the epistemological, but the ontological aspects of the absolute, and both the German idealists and the early Romantics claim that we can have knowledge of it. What is common to both, however, is that they trace back the emergence of the post-Kantian absolute to criticism, which for them is not unjustifiable, of Kant's notion of the unconditioned. It is merely an epistemological notion, a regulative ideal with no ontological status, with no reality. If any ontological aspects of the post-Kantian absolute are at all discussed, then those tend to be ascribed to the influence of Jacobi, Goethe, and Spinoza. So one reason for this widespread view is a tacit endorsement of one contemporary reception of Kant's transcendental idealism, the one that goes back to some of Kant's first interpreters, Reinhold and Hegel. On this view, transcendental idealism is primarily an epistemological position, according to which transcendentally real transcends our cognitive capacity as such and has no special ontological status, is an empty category, because that which goes beyond all our possible concepts may not be real. This reception of Kant's transcendental idealism ignores Kant's long arguments for the relevance of our specific forms of a priori intuition, space and time, and the fact that by transcendentally real, or the thing in itself, Kant has in mind objects which, although they do not conform to the conditions of our a priori intuition, have genuine, ultimate, or unconditioned properties, and therefore are objects with an even greater ontological status than those that are transcendentally ideal. This is because in comparison to the phenomenal realm of appearances, where one item depends on another, to which is conditioned by another ontologically, in effect by its cause, a whole by its parts, and so forth, the objects in the noumenal realm are unconditioned, not ontologically conditioned by other things. While one must acknowledge the complex constellation within which the post-Kantians receive Kant's philosophy, one should also not underestimate the degree to which they were familiar with Kant's writings, particularly the Third Critique. My aim is to draw attention to Kant's conception of genius, a notion that became central for the early Romantics, as well as Schelling and other post-Kantian thinkers, as instrumental for developing a conception of the absolute that has both epistemological and ontological components, that is, the emphasis on it as the foundation of self-consciousness that remains inaccessible to our knowledge, and at the same time as being real and not merely subjective. This is possible because Kant's notion of genius presupposes both spontaneity and receptivity to something that goes beyond the limits of discursive thought and is not reducible to it. While other commentators have noted Kant's reference to surpassing nature in his definition of genius, they also argue that this should not be understood in any metaphysical sense. And it is precisely this reading of the legacy of Kant's aesthetics that is either pertaining merely to the subject, her feelings and content of her mind, or if going beyond the mere subject, then certainly not in any metaphysical sense, that I wish to challenge. I chose to demonstrate the main points of my approach in the examples of Schelling and Schopenhauer. This may not be an obvious choice of philosophers to be paired together, especially if Schopenhauer's following comment is taken seriously. I quote, "I have overtaken Kant and the boundaries he drew, while always remaining on the soil of reflection, and thus of honesty, and so without windbag pretext of an intellectual intuition or absolute thought that characterized the period of pseudo-philosophy between Kant and myself." End of quote. But what does pair them together is one, the central role of genius in their philosophical systems, two, the elements of spontaneity and receptivity one can identify in their conceptions of genius's production, and three, the loss of personality this creative product entails. I will first start with a brief overview of Kant's conception of genius and then move to my discussion of Schelling and then Schopenhauer, respectively. Schopenhauer's part is going to be a little shorter because I realize I just don't have enough time for everything. First, spontaneity and receptivity in Kant's conception of genius. So while Goethe for the early Romantics and Schelling was an example of genius, it was Kant's philosophical account of genius's production, a production that presupposes both an act of spontaneity or rule-giving, as well as passivity, a receptivity to the gift of nature, as he phrases it, that served to them as one of the core catalysts for what they considered was carrying out the critical project to its completion. According to Kant, a genius's cognitive faculties, imagination, and understanding must relate to each other in a free harmony so that her work will be capable of eliciting the same free harmony of the faculties in the observer, and thus be judged as beautiful universally. But if the explanation of a genius's productive faculty, her productive imagination, were reduced to the necessary condition for evoking a proper aesthetic response in the observer, then it would not be possible to distinguish a genius's productive faculty from an artist who proceeds by mere taste, which Kant defines as a faculty for judging. The work of the latter, just as the work of the former, can elicit a free harmony of the faculties in the observer and stand the test of aesthetic judgment. However, in Kant's view, the artist who proceeds by taste alone proceeds by imitation. She learns how to give her work a purposive form through a slow and painstaking process of holding her work up and judging it against the works of superior masters or geniuses. A genius, on the other hand, does not learn through imitation how to give her work a purposive form. Rather, a genius creates, which for Kant is to say that a genius's productive faculty, her imagination, requires spirit, Geist. The connection between the originating source of genius's inspiration and nature is revealed in the following passage, quote, "Spirit is the secret source of life. It is not subordinated to the whim, but its movements come from nature," end of quote. This is from one of his Reflexionen. And it is this originating source of a genius's inspiration that Kant has in mind in his definition of genius as, quote, "the inborn disposition of the mind, ingenium, through which nature gives the rule, Regel to art," end of quote. The meaning of the term nature in Kant's definition is ambiguous, but from the Pillau lectures on anthropology, we'll learn that the term nature in Kant's definition denotes the idea of nature as a whole, or nature understood in its systematic unity. So a little bit longer passage. I quote, "Spirit is also the enlivening of the faculties by the idea. The idea does not have a meaning of a concept. One can have concepts independent of an idea. The development of a whole science belongs to an idea. The idea is business of the understanding, but not through abstraction, because these are then concepts. Idea is the principle of the rules. There is a double unity, a distributive and a collective unity. The idea concerns always the unity of the manifold as a whole. The idea contains the principle of the manifold as a whole," end of quote. Because the idea of nature as a whole, of what Kant in the appendix of the Critique of Pure Reason calls the idea of a world whole, is not an idea of an empirical reality that is engendered discursively. The possibility of the world whole can be explained only if reason posits an unlimited understanding that is analogous to ours in its empirical use. Therefore, the idea of nature as a world whole necessarily implies nature's supersensible substrate, and it is the supersensible substrate that enlivens a genius's productive imagination. Thus, in Kant's view, the rule exhibited in the works of genius does not have a merely subjective significance, referring to nothing but the mind of the artist. Instead, it entails much stronger ontological commitments than is commonly acknowledged in Kant literature. That is to say that it presupposes something that goes beyond a genius's creative subjectivity through the notion of an order that is propulsive for human faculties in general, and goes beyond the minimum required for knowledge and action to occur at all. Because for Kant in his critical period, we cannot have theoretical knowledge of the supersensible. Genius can never summarize the steps that are necessary to complete her creative process. That is, it cannot itself describe or indicate scientifically how it brings its product into being. Although a genius artist cannot formulate the rules of her production, and thus we can say she proceeds unconsciously, this unconscious production is not a blind production. Put differently, a genius knows when, with respect to her work, she gets things right or wrong. This is because a genius's intuition of an indeterminate principle generates the harmonious play of her cognitive faculties, imagination and understanding. Thus, a genius's intuition of an indeterminate principle results in a judgment, although it is not reached through a judgment. In order to understand better how a genius's intuitive understanding amounts to a judgment, it is helpful to consider Kant's account of judgment in the first critique. I quote, "If the understanding in general is explained as the faculty of rules, then the power of judgment is the faculty of subsuming under rules, of determining whether something stands under a given rule, causa data legis, or not," end of quote. Thus, a genius's creative process amounts to a series of evaluative acts in which a genius judges which particulars, colors, symbols, metaphors, notes, in the case of a musical composition, she should choose in order to express the intuitive content so that the expression meets the epistemic standard of the purposive arrangement of her cognitive faculties. Because works of genius presuppose the rule that exhibits the idea of nature's supersensible substrate, works of genius, as with the beauty in nature, exhibit nature's moral purposiveness. The aesthetic experience of the work of genius prompts the reflective judgment to represent the work of genius as being contingently in accord with our minimal rational requirements. That is to say that the work of genius has the capacity to put our cognitive capacities into a state of free harmony, and harmony of the faculties is a condition of any cognition in general. But the principle of nature's purposiveness exhibited in the work of genius, like the principle of nature's purposiveness exhibited in the beauty of nature, suggests also that nature may be in accord with the maximal demands of our rationality, that is, with the ends of our rationality or morality. Because the works of genius elicit the free harmony of the faculties, they facilitate the transition to the supersensible within, and I can say more about that in Q&A. However, since works of genius exhibit nature's purposiveness, they indirectly or symbolically, like the beauty of nature, exhibit the idea of the highest good, as I have argued that elsewhere, and therefore provide the transition to the supersensible without. Thus, the aesthetic experience of a work of genius, just as the aesthetic experience of the beauty of nature, serves as a sign that what we hope may in fact be realizable, and it is in this capacity that the works of genius and beauty of nature serves as a source of moral motivation. And now to Schelling. So I will start with his letters on dogmatism and criticism and with his 1800 system. Receptivity and spontaneity in Schelling's letters on dogmatism and criticism. In the first letter, Schelling writes, with the presupposition of the idea of a moral God, we lose the proper principle of aesthetics. The further the world is from me, and the more I put between it and myself, the more my intuition of it becomes restricted, and the less possible is that abandonment to the world, the mutual approach, the reciprocal yielding in contest, which is the proper principle of beauty. End of quote. Schelling does not explicitly mention whose philosophical position he has in mind in the passage above. However, there are convincing reasons to argue that Schelling is referring to Kant's discussion of beauty as a symbol of morality. According to Kant, when we experience the beauty of nature, nature appears to be beneficial to us, which gives us hope that nature is conducive to our moral ends. What Kant interpreted as the significance of beauty of both nature and art, its role in representing nature as cooperative with our moral ends, and as something that we interpret as if created by higher understanding, analogous to ours, God, is something that for Schelling amounts to losing the proper principle of aesthetics. According to Schelling, to approach nature as if created by a moral God, cooperative with our moral ends, is to approach nature as a representation, which interferes with being genuinely affected by its beauty and abandoned to it. Schelling argues that there is a passivity involved in aesthetic experience, if it is to be genuinely aesthetic. Of course, this is not an entirely fair criticism of Kant, because for Kant, unlike for the rationalist philosophers, aesthetic judgment is never a species of cognitive judgment. But Schelling's criticism is aimed against Kant's principle of purposiveness and the meta-aesthetic connection it affords between beauty and morality. So in aesthetic experience, for Schelling, we feel nature in its beauty, and as we are affected by it, we yield to it. But this yielding is reciprocal. Nature is affected and transformed by us insofar as we are creators. So I quote, true art, or rather the divine, theon in art, is an inward principle that creates its own material from within and all-powerfully opposes any sheer mechanism, any aggregation of stuff from outside lacking inner order. End of quote. The products of our creation exhibit a unity that is not achieved by an aggregation of parts into a whole, to wit, a unity that cannot be explicated in terms of its constitutive parts. The products of our creation exhibit an internal unity of the whole that metaphysically grounds the relation of its parts, so that the parts cannot exist independently of the whole. Unlike the discursive intellect, which depends on the given empirical manifold of intuition that it subsumes under an analytic universal, the creative intellect, in Schelling's words, creates its own material insofar as it generates its own content from a synthetic universal. However, I quote, this inward principle we lose simultaneously with the intellectual intuition of the world, an intuition which arises in us by means of instantaneous unification of two opposing principles and is lost when neither the contents nor the unification is any longer possible for us. End of quote. By the two opposing principles, Schelling understands the principle of nature, the mechanical principle, and the principle of reason, the teleological principle. Admittedly, the production based on reason's principle of purposiveness opposes, or in his words, contests, the mechanical principle of nature. But free creation, which opposes mechanical necessity, is lost when the teleological principle of reason and the mechanical principle of nature become identical in the intuitive understanding of the absolute. The creative production of the absolute, that is, the production that is no longer mediated by thought, judgment, as this was the case in Kant, entails a complete loss of self-consciousness, the loss of, he says, consciousness of myself as subject, end of quote. According to Schelling, the creative act of intuitive understanding unites both systems, the one of freedom and the one of necessity, criticism and dogmatism. Hence, it simultaneously represents absolute freedom and absolute necessity. Quote, freedom because the absolute acts by unconditioned autonomy, Selbstmacht, and necessity because it acts only according to the laws of its own being, the inner necessity of its essence. In the absolute, there is no longer any will that could deflect from a law, and also no longer any law that is not first only given through its actions, no law that has reality independent of its actions. Absolute freedom and absolute necessity are identical, says Schelling. Therefore, the creative act of the intuitive understanding represents the realization of the absolute, the unconditioned from the perspective of both criticism and dogmatism. From the perspective of criticism, because it presupposes an absolute spontaneity, and from the perspective of dogmatism, because it presupposes an absolute passivity. Both perspectives of the absolute entail the destruction of the self. The former, the destruction of the self as an acting being, and the latter, the destruction of the self as a thinking being. And this is what I take Greek tragedy to capture for Schelling, namely our human condition as a narrative of the realization of the unconditioned and the destruction of subjectivity it entails. Greek tragedy for Schelling is, he says, the highest in art, because it offers a unique knowledge of the opposition between freedom and necessity, between the principles of reason and principles of nature that are definitive of our human condition. It offers us an opportunity, I quote, to know that there is an objective power which threatens our freedom with annihilation, and with this firm and certain conviction in our heart, to fight against it in exerting our whole freedom and thus to go down, end of quote. Greek tragedy affords us knowledge of the power of the objective world, with its realm of necessity represented by the role of fate. It also affords us the knowledge of our freedom insofar as it presents us with a hero's struggle against fate and the hero's punishment. Another quote, it was a sublime thought to suffer punishment willingly, even for an inevitable crime, and so to prove one's freedom by the very loss of this freedom, and to go down with a declaration of free will, end of quote. The punishment of the tragic hero represents the end of his struggle against fate, necessity. Hence, the moment of his succumbing is a moment of his unlimited passivity. However, the act of punishment is at the same time a manifestation of his absolute freedom, because he willingly recognizes the acts committed out of necessity as his own. The destruction of the tragic hero at the end is not only his destruction as an acting subject in the face of absolute necessity, but also his destruction as a thinking subject in the face of absolute freedom that experiences no opposition from the object. Insofar as creative action is an action that realizes the unconditioned, that grounds both systems, it is not surprising that Schelling contends that it, quote, cannot distinguish dogmatism and criticism. They can differ only in the spirit of the action and only insofar as the spirit demands the realization of the absolute as an object, end of quote. Creative action, which unifies both systems, distinguishes them in spirit insofar as in the creative process, one can focus more on either the act of creation or on the product of creation, the work of art. The former is the spirit of criticism, that is of practical reason, because it approaches the absolute as the object of freedom. I quote, the object of an endless task, end of quote, to wit, an infinite action. The latter is the spirit of dogmatism, that is, of theoretical reason, insofar as it focuses on the product of creation, which is the absolute as realized and objective, and which therefore becomes an object of knowledge. In fact, the way Schelling's discussion of beauty frames the letters is revealing of these two perspectives on creative action. His discussion of aesthetics in the first letter focuses on the critical perspective, that is, the perspective of an infinite action, the absolute as the object of freedom, and his discussion of Greek tragedy in the final 10th letter takes the perspective of dogmatism, the absolute as the object of knowledge. This framing of the letters is suggestive of a special relation between philosophy and art. On the one hand, with the concluding passages on Greek tragedy in the 10th letter, Schelling suggests that the capstone of philosophy, namely the realization of the absolute, is an art and not a philosophical system. On the other hand, by focusing on the production of the absolute and by adding a literary quality to his letters, Schelling also suggests in the paragraph cited above that the capstone of philosophy should not only be an art, but also a philosophy that is itself like art, a product of a creative reason, he says, schöpferische Vernunft, which is characteristic of a few select kindred spirits. I'm sort of not here explaining the literary quality of the letters, but I mean, anyone who's familiar with them, with the letters, probably will agree, hopefully, with me that there's a certain personal aspect, confessional aspect to the letters that add to the literary quality of the text. Now, moving to his 1800 system. Spontaneity and receptivity of a creative reason in Schelling's 1800 system. The 1800 system is conceived as a systematic history of self-consciousness. Why history? This is due to the radical finitude built into Schelling's conception of the I, from which the 1800 system is to start. Unlike Kant, for whom the finitude of the mind is defined by its receptivity to things that must be given to it in intuition, for Schelling, for whom we cannot assume anything pre-existing external to the mind given his skepticism, the I itself is conceived as the original duality of the subjective and the objective, conscious and the unconscious, mind and nature, infinite and the finite. This original duality Schelling presents as the original conflict within the mind, one aspect denying the other, insofar as spontaneity opposes receptivity. The conflict resolves itself in the mind's productive activity through which it turns itself into its own object, gradually achieving ever higher degrees of self-consciousness. The history starts with the lowest degree of self-consciousness, which Schelling identifies as nothing else but an act of self-intuition as such. It is an unmediated, I quote, identity of subject and object where the intuited is also the intuitant, end of quote. Given this unconditioned first principle of philosophy, the organ or the principal instrument of philosophy must be intellectual intuition, I quote, a knowing that is simultaneously a producing of its object, end of quote. Intellectual intuition is for the transcendental philosophy what space is for geometry. Just as in geometry, all its constructions are different ways and means of delimiting the outer intuition of space, in philosophy, all its concepts are simply different delimitations of intellectual intuition. While through intellectual intuition, a philosopher constructs theories and concepts about nature of self-consciousness, the philosopher can present this knowledge about self-consciousness in a merely, Schelling says, subjective fashion. In other words, the philosopher's theories and concepts about the dual nature of self-consciousness, on the one hand, it's intentional and conscious, and on the other, its natural and unconscious aspect, lack objective reality. Unlike a geometer who establishes the universal truth of her constructions using proofs, for a transcendental philosopher, it cannot be, I quote, established beyond doubt that such an intuition does not rest upon a purely subjective deception, end of quote. This objectivity, however, is achieved in art. The work of genius, the dual nature of self-consciousness, is no longer mere philosophical theory, but is rather manifested in a concrete product, a work of art. This is the reason why Schelling claims that aesthetic intuition is, I quote in his words, intellectual intuition become objective. An artistic genius in her work reconciles what to a philosopher was the goal of infinite striving. That is, an artistic genius reconciles the unconscious and conscious elements of the I. So, aesthetic production as a form of production must be a conscious activity, but given that it ends in a concrete product, there must be a point at which the conscious and the unconscious activity coincide. So we see the theme from the letters being repeated also in the system. A moment of, I quote again, an infinite tranquility in which all contradictions are eliminated, all riddles resolved, end of quote. Since the production begins with freedom and ends in the identity of the conscious and the unconscious activity, this identity will appear to the producing subject as a contingent harmony. As Schelling says, the intelligence will feel itself astonished and blessed by this union, will regard it, that is, in the light of a bounty freely granted by a higher nature, by whose aid the impossible has been made possible, end of quote. So what Kant in his definition of genius identifies with the activity of nature in a genius's production or spirit, Schelling in his 1800 system identifies with the involuntary and unconscious nature of a genius's production. That is, the fact that the creative production of an artistic genius is motivated by an inspiration, or he says an irresistible urge. Unwiderstehlicher Trieb, end of quote. The fact that on Kant's view, a genius cannot summarize the steps involved in the production of her work, that is, that the originality of the work of genius surpasses any skill, and that for Kant, the meaning of a genius's work can never be fully exhausted, even by the genius himself, Schelling calls, quote, the element of poetry in art, end of quote. An artistic genius for Schelling is compelled to, he says, say or depict things which he does not fully understand himself and whose meaning is infinite, end of quote. What Kant identifies with taste, and more precisely the practice of judgment, in Schelling becomes the conscious aspect of the aesthetic production, exercised with thought and reflection, and can be learned. And just as Kant argues that exceptional works of art or works of genius artists require both taste and spirit, Schelling, but now grounding his position in his own system, argues the same. Quote, it is self-evident from this, however, that it will be utterly futile to ask which of the two constituents should have preference over the other, since each of them, in fact, is valueless without the other, and is only in conjunction that they bring forth the highest, end of quote. And just as in Kant, it is the power of imagination that in its free harmony bridges the gap between nature and freedom by pointing to the supersensible, so also for Schelling, imagination is the power, Vermögen, that serves as a bond, das Band. Thus not in a mere harmony with the intellect or the understanding, but offering a unity between the real and the ideal, the conscious and the unconscious. This is perhaps a unique moment in the history of philosophy that a philosophical system culminates in artistic production. For Schelling, art is, he says, at once the only true and eternal instrument, organon, and document of philosophy, end of quote. The art of genius is a document of philosophy because it serves as a realization of the philosopher's intellectual intuition, at once a piece of evidence for and a proper realization of the philosopher's strivings. Thus, genius is a capstone of philosophy because the objective realization of the unity of the unconscious and conscious element of self-consciousness, which completes Schelling's system of transcendental idealism, depends on a rare occurrence of a very special individual in history. But Schelling also seems to suggest that genius is a keystone of philosophy insofar as the art of genius is the organon or the instrument of philosophy. I quote, art is the paramount das Höchste, to the philosopher, precisely because it opens to him, as it were, the holy of holies, where burns in eternal and original unity, as if in a single flame, that which in nature and history is rent asunder, and in life and action, no less than in thought, must forever fly apart. End of quote. In the system, Schelling remains ambiguous regarding the implications this may have for the practice of philosophy. Similar to his argument in the letters, Schelling suggests that the art of genius is the instrument of philosophy insofar as it is the object of the philosophy of art, which interprets self-consciousness, the condition of philosophical practice in its objective form. But he also suggests that the art of an artistic genius is a model for philosophical practice insofar as the philosopher should be imitating the aesthetic intuition of an artistic genius. By suggesting that philosophy should imitate an artistic genius, Schelling comes close to the early Romantics. By suggesting that philosophy should interpret the works of an artistic genius, Schelling anticipates his later philosophy of identity, according to which, in contrast to his early phase, the unity of the ideal and real, or the absolute, can become the object of philosophical knowledge. Now I turn to Schopenhauer. Spontaneity and receptivity in Schopenhauer's conception of genius. Just as Schelling reserved a special place for art and a genius artist in his philosophical system, so did Schopenhauer. If we, writes Schopenhauer, abstract completely from the genuine world as representation, nothing remains except the world as will. The will is the in itself of the idea, which completely objectifies it. It is also the in itself of the particular thing and of the individual cognizing it, which together objectify it incompletely. End of quote. Outside of the relation between the knowing subject and the object of knowledge, the will manifests itself as a blind urge, but not every relation between the knowing subject and the object of knowledge affords an adequate objectification of the will presenting itself as the object of knowledge. The ordinary form of knowing, which on some level includes animals and not only humans, is led by the principle of sufficient reason, which merely pursues the relation between things, which ultimately is related to our own will. The proper form of knowledge, or the proper form of will's objectification, is to stop considering, Schopenhauer writes, the where, when, why, and wherefore of things. End of quote. And instead, we need to consider the what of things. Individual entities represent an imperfect objectification of the will. It is most imperfect in inanimate matter, more perfect in plants and animals, and most perfect in human beings. But what constitutes the idea is what is essential in all these levels of objectivation of the will. It is the what of things. Only human beings, contends Schopenhauer, is there a pure separation of cognition from willing. End of quote. The complete separation of cognition from the will is only possible in exceptional cases. This is the case when the subject ceases to be merely individual and now becomes the pure, willless subject of cognition. He says, no longer concerned with relations following the principle of sufficient reason, but instead resting and becoming absorbed in a steady contemplation of the object presented, aside from its interconnections with any other object. End of quote. It is art, and more specifically the works of genius, that repeats, he says, the internal ideas grasped through pure contemplation. It repeats what is essential and enduring in all the appearances of the world, and depending on the medium in which it repeats the ideas, it takes the form of either the visual arts, poetry. Art originates in the cognition of the ideas alone, and its only goal is communication of this cognition, end of quote. But what interests me in Schopenhauer is how his, we will see later, metaphysics of the will complicates the relation of spontaneity and receptivity in genius's production. The normative requirements of genius's production resonate with those in Kant, For the latter, the free harmony of the faculties is the normative standard of genius's production. On the one hand, we have a wealth of imagination, and on the other, we have the understanding. Kant claims that aesthetic reflection and the free harmony of the faculties is an action of the power of imagination. Entails the view that the imagination, following its own law, provides, as it were, a schema of a universal that goes over and above the formal conditions of the possibility of empirical cognition, while still being consistent with the latter. For Kant, there is a surplus and excess of cognitive material that cannot be exhausted by the resources of the understanding, which does not exclude the possibility of being able to talk about it meaningfully, engaging in a meaningful and yet inexhaustive interpretation of a work of art. When this is translated to Schopenhauer's metaphysics of the will, Kant's faculty of the understanding stands for cognition that is in the service of the will, it seems like it, namely the one that follows the principle of sufficient reason, the realm of determinate concepts and purposes. The condition of genius's production is absolute objectivity, that is the cognition that is independent of the will and aimed at grasping not the imperfect manifestation of the will, the particular, but the essence of things, the will itself, represented in the idea. This contemplative state of genius, Schopenhauer at times describes in the Kantian fashion as disinterested, and other times as, I quote, purely intuitive state. It is intuitive because it is a capacity to lose oneself, as Schopenhauer writes, in intuition and to withdraw cognition that originally only existed in its service to the will, end of quote. Thus, insofar as this contemplative state abandons the abstract concepts of the principle of sufficient reason and the service of the will, it is a state of receptivity. However, Schopenhauer's genius follows the one of Kant insofar as he emphasizes that the wealth of imagination is necessary, but not a sufficient condition for genius. In Kant's terms, one must have spirit, but also taste. Imagination, writes Schopenhauer, has been recognized as an essential feature of genius, and the two are sometimes even considered identical. The first conclusion is correct, he writes, but not the second. End of quote. Rich imagination is the necessary condition for genius because, he says, the genius needs imagination in order to see in things not what nature actually created, but rather what it was trying unsuccessfully to create, end of quote. But the converse is not true. One can have a wealth of imagination and be a daydreamer. That is, come to know merely the relation of the figments of imagination, not ideas. This is Schopenhauer's version of Kant's claim that genius needs spirit, the wealth of imagination, and taste. In Kant, this amounts to the exercise of judgment, holding the wealth of imagination to the normative standard of the free harmony of the faculties. But in Schopenhauer, it stands for the fact that in genius, the wealth of the imagination must be conducive to the cognition and replication of the ideas. He's incredibly reticent in terms of how that replication happens, the actual production. But hopefully I will make further progress in that in the future, near future. But the relation of spontaneity to receptivity is further complicated in Schopenhauer with his, again, metaphysics of the will. The act of genius's production is ultimately the act of will's self-cognition. I quote, "The in itself of life, the will, existence itself, is a constant suffering, purely miserable, partly horrible. On the other hand, the same thing as representation alone, purely intuited or repeated in art, free from pain, affords a meaningful spectacle. He, the artist, is riveted by his observations of the spectacle of the will's objectivation. He comes to a stop with it, does not tire of observing it, and repeating it as a presentation, and in so doing himself bears the cost of the performance of this spectacle. He is himself the will that has objectified and remains in a state of constant suffering." So, end of quote. So I'm going to stop here. I'm running out of time. But just the idea with Schopenhauer that really interests me, that the relation of spontaneity and receptivity is not so easily translatable in Kantian terms because of the metaphysics of the will. The final actor and creator, even in the work of art, seems to be the will. So to what extent can we really ascribe spontaneity to the creative agency of Schopenhauer, that is then later also picked up by Nietzsche in The Birth of Tragedy, the artist as an actor and the spectator being in the service of the will. So I'll end with that. I mean, the questions are that I personally have is a certain kind of loss of subjectivity that this sort of creation and production of the absolute entails in both Schelling and Schopenhauer seems to be the cost of the creative condition, that we lose the self, which is certainly not something that Kant wants to give up. So a part of my Kantian criticism of the post-Kantian developments of this thought. All right, thank you. So.
Yeah, so first of all, just thank you for the talk. I particularly was interested in the experiential element that comes up particularly at the end of your talk with Schopenhauer. The idea that for Schopenhauer, the observation of art, the creation of art, the contemplation of art is a cessation or a release of the suffering, which is normally the state of existence, right? That there's a calm, one might even go far as to say a joy in contemplating art. With Schelling, on the other hand, I think there's something far more ambiguous, actually far more ambivalent, I would say, going on. And you know, in the system of transcendental idealism, he talks about the experience of art as being this subject of a dark unknown force, which presumably is slightly more dark, right? I mean, this idea that you're subject to unconscious forces outside of your ability to know. Indeed, Schelling eventually will go on later in life to create a definition of the uncanny as that which ought to have remained hidden and has come to light, which Freud will pick up in as his own definition of the uncanny at the beginning of the 20th century. And so I'm wondering about a kind of possible ambivalence towards the very idea of being able to access the absolute, which seems to be the goal of originally that which art can provide that philosophy can't, and later something that philosophy itself should also be striving to provide. Is there a dark side to that access?
Yeah, I think he's more optimistic in his early phase. And I picked on purpose his early writings, the Letter 1795 and the System 1800. So this indivisible remainder is the topic of his freedom essay, which is his middle period, where he becomes much more skeptical to what extent is the absolute fully transparent to our cognition. But I think the letters and the 1800 system, they're still more optimistic in a sense that it's really the art that makes that transparent, or that affords us an occasion for having that epistemic access to the absolute. But I'm not really sure that I understood well the bridge or the connection between Schelling and Schopenhauer. You think that there is more of an optimism when it comes to art and genius in Schopenhauer than there is in Schelling overall. I mean, there is a certain element in which, you know, the artist in Schopenhauer is supposed to sacrifice himself for, oh, you're missing the microphone, for the production of the art. So it comes also at a certain cost. Do you have a
Thanks.
Yes.
So actually, I wasn't talking about optimism as to the possibility
Yeah.
of accessing the absolute. I was talking about whether the experiential aspects of doing so would end up being pleasurable or not, right? So that it is actually in the system of transcendental idealism where I agree that he's optimistic about the ability of art to do this, that he actually says it is for the producer precisely what destiny is for the agent, namely a dark unknown force which supplies the element of completeness or objectivity to the piecework of freedom, and goes on to say that it is an incomprehensible agency which supplies objectivity to the conscious without the cooperation of freedom and to some extent in opposition to freedom. There would appear to be a kind of dark side. And so my bridge to Schopenhauer was just that it seemed like quite a different description of what the experience is like.
Yeah, there's obviously a calming experience in Schopenhauer and so forth. But I think I would reiterate my point that for the early Schelling, yes, there is this element of the unconscious in nature, but with the unification with freedom, that's the unity of freedom and necessity, which is the absolute, that art does afford us the knowledge and full epistemic access to it. And that later changes in the freedom essay where we have the unconscious at the dark side being the indivisible remainder, that it's always an aspect that is hidden from us, which I think, he goes back more to his Kantian roots in the middle period than in the early period. But thank you. Yeah,
thanks.
Thanks, Lara. I wanted to ask about the relation to Kant. I mean, I have a sense that somehow there is a continuity there, but there's also very distinct differences when you get to Schelling and Schopenhauer. And I guess that could come up in two contexts. I mean, in the letters, the first chapter divides an aesthetics of criticism from an aesthetic of dogmatism. The first is the sublime, and the second is more the restful abandonment in the beautiful. And in that sense, tragedy would be something which can't quite fit Kant's conception. It is a combination of the failure that is intrinsic to the sublime and some abandonment and restfulness that belongs to the beautiful. In that sense, it would be, the affirmation of failure or of what fate brought about, and a unity of necessity and freedom. The second thing, quickly, is the question of form and content. I mean, it seems like both Schelling and Schopenhauer go way beyond the certain formalistic aspect of Kantian aesthetics, meaning that content itself has a kind of presence, and those are the ideas, I would take it in the Platonic sense, the archetypes, rather than anything that you would have in the Kantian system. I mean, Schelling, it's the relation between the content of art as mythology, the gods of mythology, and the various media. But this aspect of archetypes that comes up in Goethe is really the way in which the dogmatist side is fully present and forms the problem for a unity of the ideal and the real, the activity and the receptivity there. So there's some idea of imitation, I think, in Schopenhauer, of partaking in ideas that Kant would never or could never account for in what it means to have nature, as it were, speaking through the genius.
right. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not claiming that they're strict followers of Kant. That I mean, they had very ambitious project. I mean, as I quoted from Schopenhauer, there are those that I don't want to talk about who stand between me, Kant, and myself. But there's a certain reference, obviously, that they take Kantian critical philosophy as a point of departure, and then they want to transgress, as they say, Kant's critical limits. I'm not I don't want to argue that they are strict followers of Kantian philosophy. What really interests me is maybe to bring more justice to the current interpretations of the legacy of Kantian aesthetics and the development of post-Kantian philosophy. As I said at the beginning, what really motivates me is that oversimplification of Kant's aesthetics as being merely either, epistemological, subjective, or, either epistemological or and then if it's epistemological, then it's, restricted to the forms and principles, and then merely subjective, restricted to the feelings, right? No connection to the ontological and the metaphysical aspects that we find in the post-Kantians, including what you call is the content of art, right? The ideas, the connection to Plato, the demiurge, and so forth that you have in Schelling and Schopenhauer. This is why I emphasized, the meaning of nature in the passive aspect of genius, right, and the connection to the supersensible that we also find in the works of art and the beauty of nature. And what interests me is how that is being transformed in its own way in the aesthetics or philosophy of art in Schelling and in Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer is new for me. So I owe a paper on Schopenhauer, so I'm just sort of using this as an occasion to explore a little bit more the connections. You'll excuse me on that. But yes, I'm not denying that there is a full transformation. But also want to acknowledge a certain indebtedness that they have to Kant's critical philosophy. What I couldn't understand quite well is why you connect the Platonic ideas or the content of art that we find in Schopenhauer and Schelling. Why do you relate that to the dogmatic philosophy of Schelling's letters?
Because when you start with the absolute substance, and you
sense,
divide
yes,
into the many are the ideas and the gods, and so you get to content and not to form, which is always the subjective activity.
Okay, yes, absolutely, thank you.
Gentleman in the back.
Thank you. Throughout your talk, and again at the very end, you used the locution producing the absolute. I don't think I understand that phrase. I was particularly troubled placing it in the context of the quote by Reinald Goetz that is the frame of that conference, first part of which reads, "Production is bureaucratic." So it conjured up for me the image, frightening image of an absolute bureaucratic bureaucracy. So perhaps you could liberate me of this uncanny fantasy.
Thank you. I think that's a legitimate correction here. What I mean in making a reference to actually Schelling's notion of schöpferische Vernunft, or creative reason. So probably a better word to use it to translate that term would be creating the absolute. But I mean, why? I mean, it's not. Perhaps it was an unconscious. I want to say mistake, an unconscious use of the word production on my part, insofar as when it's not that they're creating absolute out of nothing, right? So yes, I'm referring to the schöpferische Vernunft, but on the other hand, I wanted to emphasize that to some extent, the artist in his or her passivity is an instrument of the absolute as well. So in that sense, I turned away from the word creation sometimes, occasionally, and use the word production. But I'll give this choice of words some thought. Thank you. That's a good point. Certainly not, sorry. I mean, certainly not, obviously from everything that I said, absolute is not an outcome of technical production. This is exactly what they're actually challenging, both Schelling and Schopenhauer, right? So that should have been an obvious no. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think I also had a question about the relationship between Kant's treatment of taste and genius on the one hand, and Schelling's and Schopenhauer's on the other, and in particular, the what I would take to be the tendency of the or the that the latter two certainly associate genius with the activity of a creative intellect, which in turn is associated with the divine intellect. But I'm not sure I was clear on the way that you were characterizing genius in Kant in order to bring out, I suppose, what I understood to be the continuity that you were suggesting obtained. I thought, for example, that, so I thought there were three things you said that I was unsure about. One was that genius involved intuition, the second that it involved intuitive understanding, and the third that it involved intellectual intuition. And I was sort of unsure about all three moves, I guess. But this is something I'm kind of trying to still think about because, of course, if an intuition is an indeterminate, or sorry, an immediate and singular representation of an object, then it's important for Kant to deny that that's what's involved, at least in the judging of beauty, which admittedly is the work of taste rather than genius. So what the question, I guess, is, it's important that for Kant, the concern with beauty is a concern with that which is available only to human beings, right? That is neither to divine beings nor to mere beasts. The worry, I guess, would be that the association of the supersensible that's proper to the judging of beauty could then not be strictly identified with anything that at least a divine kind of intuitive understanding could be concerned with. So then I guess maybe my question is, sorry, I'm taking a moment to get there, but is, on your reading, the role of genius as that by which nature gives the rule to art meant to accomplish a kind of transition between beauty as like a topic that for Kant is available only to beings who are finite and rational in one and the same capacity, to a kind of supersensible which is somehow associated with the object of a creative intellect? Or are you not convinced that there would be an issue of such a transition in the first place? I don't know if I made myself clear.
Well, let me try,
Yeah.
and then we'll see.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering whether you're worried that perhaps on my interpretation, creative agency for Kant is something like a divine agency, right? Intuitive understanding, right? And it's not. And I hope that I have sufficiently emphasized that the genius's rule of production, and there is a rule.
Yeah.
It's just
Right.
that rule has a certain kind of surplus in it that goes beyond the concepts of the understanding, right? There's an element of access. So it's not reached, the rule itself is not reached through judgment, but it results in judgment. So that's something that the Post-Kantians, especially Schelling, he may be attracted to this conception of genius, but certainly he's not attracted to the conception of purposiveness without a purpose. He wants to get rid of that.
Right. I think that's my, yeah.
So, and the reason why, and part of that paragraph that I read in the letters where he says, we don't want a moral God standing between us and nature, is his commentary. I think I don't want anything like a purposiveness without a purpose standing between my reception of beauty of nature or my production of beauty either, right? So, but Kant does, and I think that's what explains the fact that genius is production, which is an aesthetic production or creation, right? Does not entail the loss of self-consciousness.
Yes,
Right? We
yes.
have a self-conscious and a judging subject, but it does entail a loss of the self in both Schelling and Schopenhauer. Right? So this is why I kind of emphasize what genius does for Kant, always in production, even though he cannot summarize the rule of the of his creative process. There's always an element of holding the particular against that normative standard, right, which is the free harmony of the faculties, and then figuring out whether it fits that normative standard, going
Yes.
back and forth, right? And you don't have that in the post-Kantians, right? There's this element of the loss of the self that they think it's necessary, if anything like the absolute is going to be created in art.
I mean, if I could have just a quick follow-up. I think, I mean, this was helpful for clarifying also what so I was wondering, I think, about, yes, precisely the role of purposiveness without purpose in the narrative because I think, right. I mean, I take it that for Kant, right, the idea of purposiveness without purpose is the idea of a purposiveness that doesn't, at least in the first place, purport to be concerned to represent an object, right? It represents the subject's relation to the object. And again, I mean, I took it that you were trying to bring out, or to push back against an interpretation of that theme in Kant that robbed it of its metaphysical significance.
Right.
But I mean, it seemed to me to be the that given that Kant does have these remarks about how beauty is a topic which only comes to be available for finite human beings, like the super sensible that's at issue there seems like it couldn't be the super sensible that was right. Okay, I'll wrap up. So yes.
questions.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Sorry. Let's talk. Yeah.
Okay, thanks so much. I have a question, I think, which is related to the point where you ended, this idea that, in a certain sense, the question of receptivity and spontaneity is complicated by the will, but I also thought that it's somehow complicated already by the configuration in Schelling. And so the question that I have is about this kind of unconscious activity that is part of the picture there. And so one way to ask the question would be to say, is unconscious activity or unconscious spontaneity a form of practical receptivity? So if you do something unconsciously, there's a certain way in which you need to let that happen in a certain sense. So you become receptive to a part of your practical activity in a way that you allow to happen in a certain sense. So just wondering whether that's a way in which we could think of this as involving a certain receptivity. That's the first question. And the second question is, I was always struck by this great idea that Schelling has, that in the work of art we find this unity of the conscious and the unconscious activity. Now, what I'm wondering about is, what does need to happen for this unity to manifest itself, or how do we how do we, how are we in the right kind of relation towards it? There's a sense in which we might think, well, I need to know this, that the unconscious and the conscious activity are one, right? There's something that I know that eventually becomes part of my self-consciousness. But I'm not sure whether that's the way to whether that's the way to think about this unity, or whether the unity is something that also, in a sense, happens in a way that eludes me, that I might feel but don't quite get. So I think the question that I'm raising is, what kind of receptivity do we need in order to grasp the unity of the conscious and the unconscious activity, or non-conscious activity? Nicht bewusst, I think, is Schelling's term. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if I understood you right, I think we're, you, and I think maybe in general, one is having a hard time acknowledging that at the end, so that unity of the unconscious and the conscious in Schelling, or the real and the ideal in the letters, ends up with the self that is not an individual subject at all. So there's a complete loss of subjectivity that he's going to later on, in the freedom essay, pedal back on it and say, maybe that's not the way to end my system, right? Maybe I should account for an individual practical agent with his orientation of good and evil. But for now, in the early essays, that's the outcome of the concrete bringing about creation of the absolute at the end. So when you're asking, how should the subject, how should we think of that receptivity in the unity of the conscious and the unconscious? What is that for the subject? There is no subject. This is why I focused on the emphasis of the annihilation, complete annihilation of subjectivity as a condition of that creative process at the end. And this is what I took his comments on tragedy to mean at the end, right? This is sort of illustrated by the death of the disintegration of the tragic hero, right? So that kind of concrete realization of the absolute presupposes the annihilation of the self. And what I'm thinking that your question basically presupposes that the self is still there. That perhaps I'm misunderstanding you. So you tell me if I'm getting that wrong.
No, that's very helpful. I'm just asking myself, doesn't there have to be someone witnessing this annihilation of the subject? So if you say the tragic hero is destroyed by the fate,
right?
Someone needs to sit in the audience and see it.
It's the job of the philosopher to interpret the meaning of the work of art, to interpret it, right? So on the receptive side, we don't have that annihilation of the subject. So that's the part of the philosophical consciousness now to interpret what the process means, and me telling you that what really entails the annihilation of the self, all of that is a job of the philosopher. But my first half of the answer was about what it means for the creative agency, which is for that agency is no longer present. It's being sacrificed to the process itself. And in both Schopenhauer and Schelling, I have to think a little bit more about the Schopenhauer part, because it seems to be ambiguous there. But what does it mean to be the subject of absolute knowing is not to be a normal subject at all, right? But I have to think if he can give me somewhere else more nuanced account of what that's supposed to mean. Yeah.
So we have two more questions. 2 more minutes? Yeah, okay.
I'd like to ask a question about Schopenhauer. There was a point in your remarks that particularly interested me, and I think it could be radicalized in a certain direction, and I wonder if you would agree with this suggestion as to how one might take it. It is the thought of Schopenhauer that all that is required to apprehend the beautiful is detachment from the Satz zum Grunde, of the principle of sufficient reason. If that's all that's required, then virtually anything can be attended to as a beautiful object. As he writes, jeder Gegenstand ist schön. That means that Schopenhauer's aesthetics actually can do entirely without, let us call it, the entire apparatus of traditional art. I don't have to go to the museum. I can experience it looking out here, looking at that dilapidated wooden fence in the way that he wants me to look at it, which is to say in suspension of all four varieties of the principle of sufficient reason. Then something emerges into that intuition that is absolutely overwhelming. And that is the very inner nature of being itself as strife, the strife within the will. So the point here that I'm trying to draw out is that Schopenhauer's notion of intuition, insofar as it's employed in the context of his aesthetics, is actually a bridge that goes up to an entire host of modernist enterprises that detach art from the conventions of, let's say, traditional forms of beauty and focus upon a particularly intense experience of, let us say, the being of objects themselves. There's a kind of ontological turn, indeed there's an ontological disclosure that is made possible by virtue of that detachment from all of our practical goings about and so forth, even our determinations of things as what they are. Schopenhauer was the first avant-garde theorist. That's the radicalization.
Early romantics before him. So that idea, it seems to me, more connected to Novalis and Schlegel, so that the idea that we can just by having a certain kind of aesthetic approach to any object, right, we can basically bring the play of the imagination and turn our observation of any object into an aesthetic experience. But the problem with Schopenhauer there is that he is not so much talking about the reception of nature. He does think that there are only few people, very select few individuals, who can render that cognition, right, into a work of art. Right. So it's one thing to have that cognition that is free of the principle of sufficient reason, but it's another one to replicate it, as he calls it, into a work of art. And that we need a very special individual, genius artists. So that's, and then when that happens, so following your comment, yes, I mean, anything can be an object of art. If we're talking about representational art, we can have absolute cognition of anything in the world, but it's that rendering which is aesthetic, right, that not everybody is capable of. So there's a specific kind of aesthetic experience that only few individuals can afford. So it's not just about having a cognition of anything, but it's also about replicating it in a form of art that matters, and then making it accessible to others as well. So, I mean, can it be modernist? I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. I have to think about it in a sense that if he's emphasizing still aesthetic rendering and aesthetic replication, right? So there is a certain kind of form of aesthetic pleasure that he presupposes that is necessary for that. And, you know, beauty and pleasure is not something that we require in modernism at all. So I would be hesitant to push it that far. So he does talk about Dutch art, right? You know, that you can focus on anything of everyday, from the everyday world, whether that's still life or scenes from a local bar, right? And then having that cognition as a condition, render it aesthetically. They're beautiful paintings, right? And they're affording an aesthetic pleasure, right? So I'm not sure that a jump to modernism is as quick as you're making it now. I have to think about that, though. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm sorry we're going to have to stop here, but please join me in thanking Lara.
Thank you very much.